All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are heading right into session 2, Enhancing Infrastructure for Economic Growth. Allow me to introduce to you the chairman as well as the session speakers. And as I introduce them one by one, I'd like to invite them to come and take their seats on stage. So let's get started with the session chair. Our session chair is Mr. Duminda Hulangamuwa. He is the current chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. He's also country managing partner of Ernst & Young, Sri Lanka and the Maldives. He's a fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, Sri Lanka, fellow member of CIMA UK, and a graduate in law from the University of London. With this introduction, let's welcome our session chair, ladies and gentlemen. Put your hands together for Mr. Duminda Hulangamuwa. And as our session chair joins us, let me introduce to you our first speaker for this session. We have Engineer Dr. Narendra de Silva, who is General Manager, Ceylon Electricity Board. He graduated with honors in electrical engineering from the University of Moratuwa and obtained a PhD in power electronics from Heriot-Watt University, UK. He's a fellow member of the Institute of Electrical Engineers UK and was General Manager at Lanka Electricity Company Private Limited. Let's put our hands together, ladies and gentlemen, for Engineer Dr. Narendra de Silva. Joining us up next is Ms. Shehara de Silva. She serves as the Managing Director of Mclarens Group of Companies. She joined Mclarens in 2003 and serves on the board of 45 companies and joint ventures. She holds an MSc in Shipping, Trade and Finance from City University, CASS Business School, London, UK, and a BSc in Economics from the London School of Economics. She's also a chartered member of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. Let's put our hands together for Ms. Shehara de Silva. And our final speaker to join this session is Professor Sirimal Abeyratne. He is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Colombo and a senior researcher at the Center for Poverty Analysis. He is chairman of the Stakeholder Engagement Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He also serves as non-executive director at LTL Holdings. He earned his PhD from the Free University of Amsterdam, and he has been a visiting fellow at universities in Japan, Vietnam, Australia, and Italy. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Professor Sirimal Abeyratne. And with that, we are ready now to commence our second session. This is Enhancing Infrastructure for Economic Growth. I'd now like to hand over control to our chairman, Mr. Duminda Hulangamuwa. Let's put our hands together for him, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I want to thank the OPA for inviting me to share this session. And also, as in Comp introduced, I also warmly welcome the 3 panelists and the speakers at this event discussing infrastructure. Our first presentation is by Narendra. May I kindly invite you? What we will do is first we'll listen to the 3 speakers, and thereafter we'll get into a Q&A. We can take questions from the audience as well as I have some questions as well. So may I invite Narendra to address the audience on renewable investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duminda. Good morning to you, all of you. It's a pleasure addressing the Professionals Association, addressing an extreme group of professionals. This is a rare opportunity I hope I get. So I'm trying to reap the maximum out of this opportunity, trying to go through the renewable roadmap and the context of this renewable infrastructure development within the country. I hope you will bear with me that this particular subject area of energy is going to be a little bit numbers heavy. So, but I'm not that much scared as in any other presentation to put forth a bit of numbers, as I know that it's a group of erudite professionals. I'll be going through with you on 9 topics. Hope time will serve me fair. Energy sector supply and demand, electricity sector supply and demand. These are 2 sectors. Energy, only 13% of energy is being covered by electricity, that we will come to know shortly. So the electricity sector supply and demand, and the energy transition. And energy transition is usually through renewables. So the envisaged RE capacity additions and the expected investment and constraints of RE development. Now, in order to track these RE capacity additions and the energy transition by that, what's the issue pertaining to the RE development and expected funding mechanisms. Of course, funding is always through tariff, so how that the tariff would affect. Development of the investment climate, and finally, in order to achieve this, we need certain mission critical infrastructure. We'll just try to browse through that fact as well. This is the country's energy picture. We use about 116,000 gigawatt hours, out of which exactly 1/3 goes to transport. And the domestic and commercials take about 41%, we bit above more than 33%, 1/3, and 26% by the industry. And this particular 116,000 gigawatt hours being supplied by 3 sources. We get biomass supplying us 46%. This is something that most of the people don't know here in the country. Still, we are thoroughly biomass dependent. Out of the entire 116,000 gigawatt hours, 53,000, 46% is served by biomass, and 41% is served by petroleum. Only 13% is supplied by electricity. This is the actual scenario. But moment we talk about energy, we straight away talk about electricity, not because of any other reason. It is the most modern form of electricity, most modern form of energy. However, it only serves at the moment 13%. Now, this is another interesting picture where we see the entire 33% of transport energy is served by petroleum. No other source is contributing to our transport sector. Whereas the industrial sector, 19.6% by biomass, 2% from petroleum and coal, there's a very small, tiny slice of coal, and 4.4% by electricity. Domestic sector, 26% by biomass, this is for cooking fundamentally, 6% by petroleum, that is also for cooking, the LPG, and then 8.6% by electricity. So that 8.6 plus 4.4 adds up to 13%. The entire 33%, 2% and 6% add to our 41%. This 19.6% plus 46% adds to that particular 47%, 26%. Now, let us look at the electricity sector. Now, here we are looking at electricity being 13%. Let us see that particular 13%. Let us go dissect this 13% and see how that this 13% been provided. It is by 4 sources: hydro, coal, petroleum based products and renewables. HFO and all the parts of the fuels fall into that petroleum category. Hydros, we generate about 4,200 depending on the rain itself. It can even go down to 2,000. It fluctuates between somewhere 3,000 to 4,000. Coal will supplement that difference, but in average about 7,500. Petroleum 3,200 and renewables at the moment is only 1,500. This is how our 16,500 or 16,400 gigawatt hours been served. So we see that 7,500 and 3,200, that's entirely non-green or non-modern. I would like to call it non-modern product portfolio. And how does the cost? Hydropower comes at about 2 rupees because the entire investment is now recovered. Coal comes in the order of about 22 rupees. We are very fortunate this year, we got a very good coal deal, but usually this is not this low, somewhere in the order of about 26, 27, 28. This time we are fortunate. Petroleum is about 58, 57, 58. Renewables in the average of about 18 rupees. So the total generation cost is about 24 rupees per kilowatt hour. The generation and the transmission and distribution cost is in the order of about 7 rupees, adding up to 32 rupees of the selling price. These are the prices of these sources are there. So basically, our total cost is about 400 billion LKR per annum. So CB collects 400 billion per annum through the tariff. How does our tariff look? Our tariff probably 3 or 6 months back was high. We were in the little bit upper margin of Asia. But with the recent 2 tariff adjustments, now we are one of the lowest in Asia. So actually, we raised our tariff for some time. CB was debt ridden. We had a debt of about 380 billion. For a company of earning 400 billion, when you have a debt of about 300 billion, that's not viable. That's not financeable. But with the rise of this tariff, we recovered about 250 billion, 250 to 280 billion. Today, our debt is in the order of about 120 billion. Now, CB is viable. It's a economically viable entity. So, this bold decision of raising the tariff and getting CB viable and reducing the tariff was the key to this entire dialogue and this success. I must confess that me as a professional, I didn't have the steel to take that decision. But fortunately, because our minister and the government took that decision, they had the steel to do that. I'm boldly claiming that. CB recovered. So today CB is at a viable position. We can raise funds, we can do investment, and we can think of modernizing the network. Our demand, that was the electricity generation context. Our demand is in the order of about 16,500, as you know. In 2030, we presume it's going to be 26,000, which will grow to 41,000 by 2040. That's our planning scenario, 2030 and 2040. There's another interesting thing happening, that is at the moment we have a night peak. Our maximum demand records at night. By 2030, we are going to see a day peak. Our day is growing faster than the night. That's an indication of our industrialization and commercialization. So with that growth, by 2030, we are going to be a day peak country. This was a dream, I suppose, when we were even in university, we were thinking one fine day the country is going to be day peak. Having a day peak gives us a very good opportunity for solar. So the major argument against solar is rapidly diminishing due to the migration of our loads from night to day. And what is the transition we are looking at? The world is at an energy transition as well as the country. We are looking at indigenous sources and low cost imported sources. We are looking at efficient network and very heavy network development. And we are looking at mainstreaming energy and restructuring the distribution sector to be scattered into microgrids and smart grid to have a very strong and stiff distribution network. As per the base case plan, we are thinking of going from almost 50% renewables to 70% renewables. So in the future, by 2030, our predominant energy sources would be our hydros, wind and solar, and wee bit of biomass. This is what the country's power system is going to be. At the moment, we are substantially coal-based, and coal, gas and the oil is providing substantial energy of the present context. It is going to change. The taste of the mix is going to change. And we are looking at, in order to achieve that, we are looking at a capacity addition of 1,500 wind and 4,000 solar. And battery energy system, 1,125 megawatts. And the pump storage plants. The hydros, having two cascaded hydros, once when you have more energy, you pump the lower hydro to the upper reservoir. So that once when we want energy, upper reservoir can drive turbines down to the lower reservoir. So this is called pump hydro. So pump hydros, we are planning of about 700 megawatts. And that's the annual investment what we are looking at. So altogether we are looking at 9 billion USD investment over the period of 2030. This is a very challenging perspective. And furthermore, we are looking at another 1,860 million USD for transmission. And the RE, issues with RE. Renewable energy is a very capital intensive source of power. Almost 4 times capital is required because OPEX is not there. This is entirely CAPEX projects. So at ab initio, at the start of it, you got to spend the entire capital, entire cost. So it's capital intensive, almost 4 times than thermals. And it is transmission intensive also. You need almost 4 times the transmission than a usual thermal power plant. And land intensive also. It needs almost 10 times the land of a thermal power plant. So these issues we got to address. In a nutshell, you need lot of transmission, you need lot of money, you need lot of land. Unless we are going to put these 3 ingredients into the soup, this is not going to work out. So in Sri Lanka, I am just laying these 3 maps: the transmission network, population distribution and the forest coverage. Forest, that part of land is not available for us. To find that, we are having 4 platforms of renewable development, what we call the MENA platform, northern platform, eastern platform and the southern platform. MENA and northern platform is wind intensive. Eastern and southern platform is solar intensive. And we are planning batteries all over the place. Other than MENA, northern, eastern and southern zones, we need storage as well, because we cannot bring entire power down to one particular point and have storage. We got to have the storage scattered. And we are looking at a very stringent or substantially large transmission network in order to evacuate this energy that we are going to generate around the country. So we are looking at a northern feeder from Abeyratne to Kilinochchi, central feeder Abeyratne Victoria Kirindivella, eastern feeder from Abeyratne to Kappalture, and southern feeder from Monaragala to Hambantota. These 4 pieces of infrastructure got to come in. If these 4 pieces of infrastructure is not going to come in, this entire roadmap is going to have a crash landing. So now the major task is to get this. 2 of them are 400 kV, 2 of them are 220 kV. Our struggle now is to get this infrastructure into place all over the world. There's a statement saying no transmission, no transition. We cannot go through that transition unless we get this transmission infrastructure. How we are going to fund it? It's through the tariff. We are having a tariff mechanism implemented now. It's a regulated cost. The OPEX and CAPEX of the entire operations being funded through the tariff. And shortly you will see another interesting mechanism coming mounted on tariff, that is this automatic revision. If we see that the tariff is going negative, cash flow is negative, there's going to be a automatic percentage increase, like tax, a percentage increase over the tariff. And if we see a positive cash flow, a correction, negative correction. So it will automatically adjust around the set tariff in order to maintain the cash neutrality. So unless these 2 mechanisms are fully operational, 100% abided by both CB and the country and the policymakers, this is not going to work. Up to now, this is 100% abide perfectly, month to month. This has been, that's the stringency and how to say that, consistency of policy. That degree of consistency of policy is required to go through this difficult terrain. I'm sure that once when you see that $9 billion US investment for generation, 1.8 billion US investment for transmission, having huge infrastructure, this needs substantial steel, substantial courage to go through this process. If that we don't hold on to this policy is strict, definitely we are going to fail. Finally, I will just put forth the way how this funding is going to take place. Every generation plant will be coupled with a last mile small piece of transmission, which will be funded by the generation plant. It is by the generation project. The grid development associated with individual of these plants will aggregate into a company where the investor can put money into that company and get his bit of transmission being done. So the contractual fortification, PPAs and contractual fortification, the legislative reforms and transmission network company for that is now well in place through the new Electricity Act. The legislative backbone to mount this flesh on is there. Now we got to blow life to this new animal through the restructuring and creating the new business entities and going through. So the backbone is now well set. So this entire legislative framework is in place. That is about the large renewables. Small renewables, less than 10 megawatts, rooftops and rooftop aggregators, the entire business models are in place. The previous one is still in the process, in the background getting developed. Still we are going for the renewable projects, but still there's little bit of background work we got to do. However, these particular 3 models are fully in place. So basically, I'm sure you understand, there's a substantial investment to be brought in. In order for that we have to create an investment climate. That got to come with the policy. So all that is now in place for us to go into this difficult task. I'll skip this part of the story where I'm just showing that when you put a lot of solar, there's a spillage of energy in the daytime that needs battery. And the microgrids is the next solution for the distribution sector. So generation sector, batteries and Those are the mission critical to the infrastructure pieces, batteries, pump storage, and microgrids in the distribution sector got to come in together in order to facilitate this entire roadmap. And finally, the India-Sri Lanka interconnection. We are talking about 10% of the total energy issue. 90% of the renewable energy potential we have not explored in this map. That is as wind available as a rich, renewable rich country, Sri Lanka. That 90% will be exploited through this India-Sri Lanka interconnection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Narendra. It's a very insightful presentation, very educating, where you laid the entire roadmap of the electric sector for the next 5 years. I'm sure there will be questions that the audience will. I also have noted some questions down. May I now have the pleasure of inviting Shehara to make the presentation on shipping and logistics, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, OPA, for having me back to speak to you at your conference. So I'm going to talk on the subject of supply chain and logistics, and with a view on what is required to enhance economic growth of Sri Lanka. I'll do a small intro into what's happening in the world, and then I'll talk about maritime, which is really my area which I am passionate about, and then get on to road and rail, and also warehousing. And then I'll talk about something very critical for Sri Lanka, which is a logistics performance index. And then I'll talk about the challenges they are facing and the opportunities along with that. So what is logistics? A quick definition. It's the origins of the word logistics actually go back to military. That gives us an idea of how complex the operation is, because it is relating to dealing with procurement, maintenance, and transportation of military people. That's how the word originated. And today, of course, it has translated into the commercial context of getting goods from farm to table, using all the modes of air, sea, rail, and road. What's happening in the world in logistics? Supply chains have become much more agile, mainly through the introduction of the Internet of Things, blockchain, and of course with e-commerce. Things have to happen much more quicker. And of course, more greener. As we heard before, sustainability has become the buzzword in logistics, and therefore creating demand for cleaner fuels and cleaner sources of energy. Automation. Warehouses are becoming with less human interference. Ships, which are becoming much more driven with technology, and even trucks without drivers. And the same for the transparency aspect. This is being demanded by the customer, where they want real-time visibility of cargo tracking, tracing, of seeing where their cargo is. And also demand forecasting using AI, where companies can use AI to see, to forecast their demand, and therefore schedule their raw materials accordingly. And of course, digital freight marketplaces, where you can book your freight online. So these are some of the global trends. I'll get into the Sri Lankan context shortly. Maritime is still the largest form of transport globally, where 80% of global trade is transported via sea. What's happening to the ships? The ship sizes are becoming larger. The ports, therefore, have to accommodate these larger ships with deeper draft terminals. They are becoming more technical. If you look at the trends in maritime, if you put it under two sections, it's decarbonization and digitalization. So ships are becoming more technical, and harbors have to then therefore adapt to service these vessels. And same with the fuels, where ports have to be geared to serve with cleaner fuels, which are demanded by these ships. And of course, the supply chain resilience and the e-commerce of the last mile delivery. Coming on to the Sri Lankan context, as per the central bank statistics, 13% of GDP is contributed by transport of goods, passengers, and warehousing. We don't have too much of the breakdown of that, but approximately about 5% of that is contributed by the maritime sector, and about 50,000 in employment. I've given here a map of the stakeholders in the maritime industry, because it's actually a collection of government, private sector associations. Starting with the ports and the airports, you get the shipping service, the ports of course all over the country, you get the shipping service providers, which are the shipping lines, the agents, the feed operators, then service providers to vessels such as bunker operators and ancillary services, and also the logistics community, which are the forwarders, the truckers, the custom house brokers. And all these players have to interact with the government agencies, including the Sri Lanka Ports Authority, Directorate General Merchant Shipping, Customs, Navy. All these are border control authorities which regulate trade in and out of the country. And of course, the customers, you have the exporters and the importers. So this is the entire community. So coming to this very famous map, where Sri Lanka is right in the middle of the east-west routes, we are placed very strategically in the Indian Ocean to be a logistics hub. So let's look at some of the reasons why we are not there yet as well. I've just put down the main ports, of course, Port of Colombo being the main container port, and Port of Galle now being developed as a tourism hub with a yacht marina, and also the Port of Hambantota, which is largely being used as a car carrier transshipment hub, and of course Port of Trincomalee, which has also the natural deep water harbor, which is ideal for ship layup, and also access to the storage tanks for oil storage. So a quick snapshot of our numbers in the Port of Colombo. We're averaging around 7 million TEUs this year as well. And the number of vessels have increased post-COVID, as you can see. But what is the most critical feature here? The most critical fact here is 80% of the port volume is actually transshipment cargo. It's not export or import, so it's nothing to do with the domestic trade. It is purely cargo coming from the region, being transshipped via the Port of Colombo, coming from one port and then discharged and then loaded on another ship to be taken to some other part of the world. This is the main business of the Port of Colombo. And you can see export-import volumes have been largely stagnant over the last few years. So doing a regional comparison of the Port of Colombo with the other transshipment hubs in the region, you can see we are still at 7 million TEUs, whereas the likes of Singapore are 3 or 4 times that capacity, and also others like Jebel Ali and Port Klang. However, the most important to note are the Indian ports which are coming up. So this is the most threatening factor for Sri Lankan transshipment status, because India has invested in several deep water harbors all around its southern coast. So what we have to note is, out of the transshipment volume handled in the Port of Colombo, about 45% is coming from Indian cargo, or even more. There's a little bit of debate about that number, but India largely transships all their cargo via the Port of Colombo. So their plan in their Sagaramala, which is their maritime policy document, is to get this transshipment back to India. which will be a massive loss for Sri Lanka. So far, we've been managing to hold on to it because of several factors that they have, limiting factors in India, which is the hinterland connectivity. Even though they build the port, they don't have the connectivity to the inland to bring in the cargoes to those ports. So that is only a matter of time till they get that connectivity. Then our port transshipment status will be at will be extremely threatened. So what is most important, is critical for us at this point, is number one, increasing the port capacity in the port of Colombo. Of course, these plans are underway. There is the ECT phase 1. I think the harbour master is here in the audience. He can tell more about this than me. Phase 1 is delayed, but it's still ongoing, I know. But the full operation of the ECT will only bring in the full value, which is a 2.5 million TEUs, which yet is being awaited. And also, of course, WCT, which is the Adani terminal, set to bring in the first ship by January next year. So bringing in this extra capacity is critical for Sri Lankan maritime industry. But not only capacity, but several other features, which I will talk about soon. So that's a quick snapshot of like containerization, but if that's only one aspect of maritime. Apart from that, we have also the capacity to serve the vessels that call the Port of Colombo with services, including bunkers, fresh water, crew changers, lube oils, food supplies, all kinds of services, which is also a critical part of the maritime industry, and also require infrastructure in order to promote, for example, bunker storage facilities. If we are to become serious as a bunker supply hub, we have at present in Colombo only 60,000 tons of bunker storage capacity, whereas Singapore, for example, will have 20 million tons. So we have to look at an exaggerated development plan for storage, because we don't produce oil in the country. We have to import it. So to be able to leverage on price, you have to import in bigger parcels. Bigger parcels, better price, storage, and then supply to the vessels. But also, we have to take account of the demand for cleaner fuels. So maybe fuels like naphtha and all the cleaner fuels have to be stored in a different way. So those are also factors that have to be considered in building tank storage capacity, and also LNG. I'm not talking much about the transport industry, because the road, of course, is the primary source of transport. About 94% is transported within the country by road. And in 2024, you can see out of that 116,000 kilometers, 11,000 is national highways, and out of that, only 300 is expressways. But of course, these expressways have added a lot of ease for the connectivity, and the port access road, which will be operational later this year, will make a huge impact to the connectivity of the Colombo port with the rest of the island network, and hopefully reduce the queues of the trailers and the trucks which are waiting to get inside the port. That's a quick map of the highways. The key point, I think something to note here is, given the sustainability, the environmental impact of the transport sector, petroleum fuels contribute to almost 78% of that demand, and again, the emissions aspect. So there is a huge move for transitioning to e-mobility, but I think we need to have a clear policy on electric vehicles, and then also servicing those vehicles, charging, and the whole network that is required to sustain that, the EVs, and the capex, of course. The rail, this is a century-old institution in Sri Lanka. I think it's facing a lot of challenges, financially as well. But if we are serious as a logistics hub, the connectivity of rail for cargo from the Port of Colombo to the hinterland is critical, and that requires severe investment in the rail network. Coming on to warehousing, the warehousing is the first point in the Port of Colombo, which the which the cargo which is being de-stuffed will be facing. And I think that, I think Harbour Master is looking at me, but sad to say that that requires much modernization, much more investment. The Port of Colombo warehouses need upgrading. Because this is the base where we can become a transshipment hub for cargo consolidation, cargo packing, value adding, and then redistributing to the region. At the moment, we can't do that because of the facilities which are limited. So even the Port of Hambantota has the logistics zone which is attached. So there is a need to develop industry and associated warehousing around those ports. Free trade zones, again, expansion, but also easing the processes of having bonded storage facilities is critical. This is where we have our potential to become a logistics hub regionally, but the red tape in doing processing that cargo, which is under customs supervision, is still very much a burden. This is just a quick snapshot. Third-party logistics warehousing, which is a critical area in logistics and supply chain. These are basically warehouses which are modern, which are racked, which are temperature controlled. Again, post-harvest loss, which is a huge issue in Sri Lanka. I think I saw the first temperature controlled warehouse which is coming up, which will really help to reduce that wastage of the agricultural produce as it goes from the farm to the table. So I come to this, which is the most important point here, which is the LPI rating. This is Sri Lanka's rating in the LPI score. We are number 73. Singapore is number 1. These are the indicators which are taken into account when ranking. And that number 1 is the ease of customs, the infrastructure, the ease of doing international shipments, the timelines, the cargo tracing and tracking ability. So under these indicators, we rank fairly low. And those are the areas which we need to improve if Sri Lanka is to be rated on this index. I just give you an example. These are the documents which are submitted to the customs when we are clearing a ship and the cargo. And these are the number of copies in red. 5 pre-arrival notice on 21 on the arrival. So we are still in the manual era of paper, manual. So digitizing the entire customs declaration process is critical to the Port of Colombo. These are the stages. The RC Hub has started. However, these are all in pilot stage and not yet implemented. And it is same for the other border authorities, not only the customs. The immigration, because when a ship comes in, we have to deal with the visa of the crew, immigration, the Department of Health, the Navy, the Coast Guard, all these submissions which are being done manually, except the SLPA, who we can transmit through Navis system, the cargo, digitally. So there is a lot of work to be done, and in the way forward, apart from upgrading the port infrastructure, which we talked about before, digitizing this entire trade process is critical for us. The import, export, the vessel clearance, the crew, there's so many aspects that are included when a ship comes into port, which is a port community system, and then that port community system should then be connected to a national single window where all the stakeholders are connected, including the customers, the freight forwarders, the warehouses, and there should be visibility and cargo tracing and tracking. And that will help us, of course, to improve on the logistics performance index and improving the connectivity. One more point I'd like to make. Just increasing the capacity of the Port of Colombo is not sufficient. There are shared services such as navigation, interterminal trucking inside the port, which also need to increase along with that. Otherwise, we will have more congestion with more ships coming in if we don't invest inside the port as well. Of course, we talked about the higher costs and the waste, operational efficiency, Again, if you look at the private terminals in the port of Colombo, the moves per hour is much higher than JCT, the government-operated terminal. So really, even looking at foreign investors for the new terminals, even the ECT would be definitely beneficial for the country. And of course, public transport, investing in public transport is critical. And then this point about consistency in government policy, because if there is this consistency, then despite a government change, there will be continuity in this investment or in whatever the initiatives that have taken. And of course, like I mentioned about the logistics mindset, improving the ease of doing business. And finally, zero tolerance on corruption. So that's my little take on things. It's a more practical viewpoint, not so academic, but I'm open for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Shehara. That was an excellent presentation on the industry, covering the opportunities, the limitations, what needs to be done in terms of policy. So I'm sure we can discuss that at the Q&A session. Now may I invite Prof. Abeyratne to make his presentation, please.
Thank you, Chairman. The OPA Organization of Professional Associations and all the members and office bearers, distinguished guests, thank you for the invite to share my thoughts on public-private partnership for infrastructure development. I don't have a slide presentation, but I have a story to tell you. So the concept, although it has not been used as a concept, is a few centuries old. Even if you look at 500 years ago, you find in Europe, in the UK and in the USA, and there have been some occasions about public-private partnership initiatives. And some of them are actually not only reported in the history, but also reported in court cases, because there have been also court cases in relation to these public-private partnerships about hundreds years of our history in the world. However, this aspect of infrastructure development, public-private partnership, took a new turn after 1980s. In both advanced countries as well as in developing countries. What was the reason for advanced countries to take a new turn and increasing these partnerships several folds after 1980s? The reason is, in fact, after 1970s, you must have noticed the crises have become very frequent in the western part of the world, the United States and Europe particularly. So as a result of the crisis, starting from 1973 oil shock, and then gradual depletion of the fiscal strength of the governments, so that the governments in advanced countries, they find these public partnerships, PPP, for their infrastructure development as a viable option. So that's the main reason why PPP, OP3 has become so much attractive after 1980s. So you can see these things happening after Thatcher's government in the UK and many other countries in Europe and also in the US, enormous expansion of public-private partnership for infrastructure development. For developing countries, the same is true, but for a different reason. What is that? In the old development model, we were focusing more on domestic savings. So you need to save more and more and more because you can generate then investment more and more and more. So saving little by little and cent by cent and building your investment funds, and then you invest and you spend about 100 years to do so. But infrastructure development is a key area that you need to have to carry out your development process also. So that's a dilemma, policy dilemma that developing countries had to face. So the developing countries also find this good combination because of their low tax revenue and inadequate financing for infrastructure development and curtailing their borrowing requirements. It is better to have partnership with the private sector. So that has been the reason for the developing countries to fulfill a development requirement and to reduce their borrowing requirement. So about 20 years ago, particularly after the turn of the century, we would see that international multilateral organizations such as the UN, World Bank, and IMF and OECD, these organizations have also become focusing more on PPP support for infrastructure development. And they also got various ways: institutional development, guidelines development, regulatory developments, to get involved in these areas and to provide technical assistance and development assistance to developing countries, particularly to developing countries, to overcome their infrastructure barriers through public-private partnerships. In fact, yesterday I saw a map showing how the World Bank funded all over the world. In fact, the largest funding for PPP activities has been, there are two countries in the world. One is India and other one is Brazil. The largest funding has come because of the largest number of infrastructure projects coming under this PPP model. We know that in India is quite far ahead of Sri Lanka in terms of utilizing public-private partnership arrangements. And there are many areas, building roads and metro systems and running airports, running seaports, and even running their economic zones, exclusive economic zones. These have been handed over to the private sector. So some of the major airports in India, some of the major ports, they are run by the private sector. So Sri Lanka is still at very infant stage in this respect. Most of the UN involvement in PPP arrangements in developing countries is related to, as they emphasize, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, 17 SDGs. PPPs are primarily on areas like water, sanitation, roads, transport, health, education, ports. In these particular areas are quite common. And these are all related to poverty reduction in those countries where World Bank is focusing more in those areas, social development areas. So the World Bank preparing guidelines and principles to make them more and more integrated with the social development, sustainable development goals that they have introduced. So the World Bank involvement, we can also see a greater involvement after 2015. In fact, they also published a set of guidelines and principles showing that how this can be done because it's a complex issue. Why? What's the importance of public-private partnerships? Because just now we mentioned as they emerge, because they can overcome the resource constraint, so that overcoming resource constraint for infrastructure development, the countries can find an easy way to do that. Apart from that, there are many other advantages of these partnerships. What are these advantages? The private sector can add the up-to-date, the state-of-the-art technology and innovations to infrastructure projects, and they can improve planning, operations and maintenance of those projects, perhaps which may not be the government that much effective and efficient in undertaking these kind of activities related to infrastructure development. So that the private sector has these resources and also capacity to introduce these elements into infrastructure development. So that's why PPP has been expanding in many other areas in developing countries, and in this country we haven't seen it that much. Now, let me also connect this to economic growth, because infrastructure is for economic growth, as your title also said here in this session. How does it improve economic growth? When you build an infrastructure project, it keeps adding to GDP. When you build a port or seaport or airport, or when you build this port city here, road network, railway line, because you require various kind of resources to be pooled together to execute those projects. So the engineers, various kind of professionals and labor and various kind of materials, and all these things requires the materials have to be produced, and so that it keeps adding to GDP. We have seen this during the crisis time, during the war time, that construction has been adding quite a lot to our GDP in this country because of this point. Then the second stage comes, it should add to people's well-being, because it improves people's traveling, their consumption levels and all these things, water, sanitation and areas, and that improves their welfare. That is one thing. But the more important thing is that they provide, most of these infrastructure projects provide very important inputs, material inputs, service inputs, a flow of inputs to GDP, to other sectors, private sector, industry, agriculture sector. So all kinds of businesses depend on the inputs coming from these infrastructure projects. So it's a main source of inputs also to economic growth. But now you should have is conditional. You can build airports and which can remain idling without planes, seaports without ships coming there. So which means now you have to maintain them as a burden, again getting money from the taxpayers. But those projects do not generate any GDP outcome after that, because it is subject to the conditionalities. Now the public-private partnerships avoid this problem. Why? Because private sector is not coming to these kind of projects unless they are convinced about the rate of return and also the stability for the time period, the longer time period that is after the project is being completed. So the rate of return on is important, rate of return on these infrastructure projects, which are built by public-private partnerships. I remember one story, because we are talking about a kind of an important imbalance. I hope you must have heard the name called Dr. Goh Keng Swee. Dr. Goh Keng Swee was the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. Before that, he was the Finance Minister. He has a PhD in economics from London School of Economics. So, in 1980, he was invited by the then our President, J.R. Jayawardena, to prepare a report for him, personal report for him. So he came here and spent some time and studied the Sri Lankan economy and prepare a report. I got this report from the grandson of Mr. J.R. Jayawardena, Pradeep Jayawardena, and I could see in almost all the pages the President's pencil marks and all these things. And I asked his grandson, and who has made these underlines and marks on the margins and all these things, and he confirmed that is my grandfather's work. So, which means that he has seriously read this report. So, now he mentioned there, after doing this report, it's a matter of personal regret for me that my report will not bring joy to you. He was telling our President in his report. It's a quotation from the report. Why? There are a couple of important critical points that he had mentioned. One is related to the discussion that we are doing here. That is, in Sri Lanka at that time, public investment and private investment, this combination got distorted. Out of total investment, the public sector, the government has been investing 85%. So, the private investment has been only 15%. He compares that with Singapore. In Singapore, private investment has been 75%, whereas public investment has been only 25%. So, you can see the distorted, this imbalance, which is very critical from the macroeconomic point of view. So, then that is why he said that my recommendations are not going to bring you joy, and also he mentioned, I remember, after all we both are politicians. And his recommendation was cut down most of these infrastructure projects carried out by the government. You know that at that time, because Sri Lanka was one of the first countries to liberalize our economy in this region, and we were more open than many other countries in the neighborhood. So that there were a lot of Western donor agencies and Western donor countries were pouring money into this country, and we had to provide counterpart funds from the government, so that the budget deficit was going high and the inflation was going high. In fact, that trend continued with the eruption of war after that. So, cut down these expenditure, and that means actually he wanted to provide space for the private sector. That is what he meant. Provide space for the private sector like we have done in Singapore. But actually, for whatever the reasons, it didn't happen in this country, and that imbalance continued, and in fact, it got worse during the last 25-30 years. We have very few PPP arrangements, public-private partnership arrangements for our infrastructure projects. Most of our large projects, India is far ahead of us, as I said just before, a little while ago. We are still investing with public funds, the government funds. In fact, almost all these projects are credit finance. Increasing it has resulted in our debt crisis also, and we know that, and that's a different topic that we are entering into if you are going to talk about the debt crisis. And the problem is now, part of this debt at that time in 2022, when we were falling into this crisis, part of this debt, about half of this debt is foreign origin. But now the projects, some of them are not giving enough returns, but we are also not a trade performing economy. And just now we heard about 80% of our port activities are related to transshipment. Why? Because there is no trade originating from the domestic economy. In fact, it's amazing for me to think that after 45 years of open economy, export promotion strategy, trade liberalization, our exports, how much we got exports? Only $12 billion a year. 12 billion. Whereas our neighboring countries, which they adopted those policies, they are counting hundreds of billions. And Singapore, as he mentioned, look at the export value in 2022, more than 500 billion. And some people say that Singapore is a service-oriented economy. No, it's the way that you look at it, the numbers that you are looking at it. In fact, Singapore is more industrialized than India. So, what is the point? The point is that our GDP also got distorted. We should have maintained that balance in public-private partnerships and also allowing the private sector to play their major role in the economy and also allowing the country to reap the benefits of trade. It's a complex issue, my last point, because it's not always as the way that we talk about public-private partnership is better than any other, but it is a complex issue, and that complex issue has to be managed very wisely, because there are numerous examples for better management of these public-private partnerships in the world, as well as worse kind of managements in the world. It can also create legal issues and development issues and political issues because of poor planning and cost of delays by the public sector and inefficiencies and mismanagement, as well as corruption, space for corruption. So these things have to be managed with transparency and with clear legal background and accountability. And only then the public-private partnerships can be a beneficial initiative for any country, like many other countries in our neighborhood have done it so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for that honest and frank presentation. How long do I have for the Q&A? 10 minutes? Just 10 minutes? Okay. That's okay. Right, thank you. So I know you have to leave. Professor, if you can wait for some time, just 15 minutes, I'll finish. But my first question is to Narendra. I mean, you read it's a fantastic presentation of the current situation and the roadmap of the electricity power sector, basically, with investments required, with the way forward for renewable energy. It was a fantastic roadmap in my view. Now, the question I have for you is that, you know, the issue that even going by what Sirimal just mentioned in our country is the policy reversals. We take one step forward and 2 steps back. Now, how much of this roadmap that you explain to the audience in very clear terms of our solution to the electricity situation of the country is cast in stone, and that we can expect a policy continuity and consistency in this from a CB's point of view?
Thank you very much for that very interesting question. Actually, the roadmap will be unique. Despite whatever the policy, this engineering context and this mathematics behind this would be the same. Therefore, the solution would be the same. Issue is once when we take policy next or policy changes, the investment potential get thoroughly reduced. This is the real issue. So, policy consistency is required to attract investment. So, the electricity sector plans would remain almost the same. I won't think any major policy diversions will take any changes to the electricity sector plans. So, the issue is the investment. We are looking at a very large investment to come in. The government does not have that money and will not have that money. Essentially, the international investors got to come into this country and do this investment. Once when they come in, we got to ensure that they have their recovery, and in that regard, the policy consistency. So, that is the place where I think the policy is going to be very critical. The smaller context of getting the plan ready is not the real issue. Real issue is the national policy got to be stable. Thank you.
Thank you, Narendra, for that answer, because the Ceylon Chamber also has been pushing hard for the electricity sector reform, and for a long time it did happen actually this time. And I only sincerely hope that the Act has been passed now after a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. Finally, that got passed. And our only sincere hope is that future governments that come into power will honor that agreement and that Act. Is there any possibility of that Act getting deferred in terms of an implementation, or will it be implemented as is the breaking of the CB to 3 and the restructuring of the sector?
The way how I'm seeing it is that the basic structure, what is being set up, is a universal structure. This is a time-tested structure. So I won't think much of engineering got to be due in the structure. There may be small changes to the structure. There may be minor tweaking depending on the policies of various governments, but still the basic structure would remain almost the same. Because these are time-tested international structure. So won't be a major change per se, but there may be minor tweaking that will come if the national policy is going to change.
Thank you, Narendra. Coming back to Shehara, you mentioned about, of course, we all part of the same chamber and we have been having discussion for a long time. Looking at your presentation, I'm aware that 80% of our volume is transshipment, because Sri Lanka can never be the reverse of, because our export-import volumes are so high. So if we are depending on 80% transshipment, you also said that we need to increase port capacity. But is that, if India is also building ports and increasing capacity in their own ports, by investing more capacity in our ports, how will that, is it a contradiction? I mean, how will that work, if you can explain that? Because the Ceylon Chamber also advocates that the 3 areas of development of the country, one is shipping logistics sector. So, so if you can explain to me that capacity building here versus India, then how will the transshipment volumes continue here? And then if you build more capacity, there will be a higher burden for the industry. I want to ask that question.
Thank you, Duminda, for the question. I think what I failed to mention is the shipping lines aspect. We work with international shipping lines, and their preference is always to use Port of Colombo, because it is of the location of how we are situated in the east-west trade route. The deviation when you're going from east to west to dock at Port of Colombo is much less than going up to Indian ports. That is for the normal east-west trade route. But if you take the capacity, actually we are late to bring this capacity. If we had this capacity 5 years ago, it would have been filled by now. But the key is, even though we expand, when CICT, the Chinese deep water terminal was built, it was filled in no time. So the key is to bring in, along with that capacity, the people who control the cargo, which is the shipping lines, as stakeholders. I think we talked about PPP. This is where PPP comes in. So you have to bring in the lines as a, not as a majority, but with even a minority stake, where they then have the incentive to use this as their hub. So bring in the cargo owners, this is not the exporters, importers. These are the international shipping lines who control this transshipment cargo. So if they have a stake, they have the technology with the gantry cranes, the systems, the computer systems, everything. So they will bring that know-how as well. Not that we don't, I mean, Port of Colombo was ranked, I think, 21st best performing port in, because we actually took advantage of the Red Sea crisis, and we, did a lot of extra transshipment this year. From January to June, you can see actually quite an increase, because we were ready to accept that extra demand that came with the geopolitical crisis. So because of our location, we get opportunities like that as well. So that having said, that is a temporary increase, and that is not a sustained. But for sustained long-term utilization of capacity, that has to come with the shipping lines investment through PPPs.
So also, Shehara, there is this popular notion about the liberalization of the industry. We all have our own views on it. I feel it is liberalized to a large extent, but there is this debate argument for the last many years that if we liberalize, we can get more lines to come in. You have an argument against that, or if you can mention something to that.
Thank you for that question, because this is a big misconception in our industry. The entire shipping industry per se is liberalized. All shipping lines in the world are free to operate in the Port of Colombo. They are free to build warehouses. They are free to own trucks, or even operate any form of logistical activity. But what do we mean by this is the Port of Colombo, or even if you look at Hambantota Port, it's already been privatized. The Port of Colombo has three private terminals. So it's already got foreign investment. So there's, like I showed on my map, there are several areas which are in this maritime. I mean, there could be shipping agents, there could be bunker providers, there are several sort of areas in the industry. The only area which is restricted for foreign investment as of now is shipping agency. Shipping agency has a restriction of 60% for locals and 40% for foreigners. This is the only area which is labor intensive in the shipping industry. There is no technology, there is no capital, there is no investment required. It is human capital, where people are employed to clear the vessels, all this documentation I showed, process all that documentation, market the services to the shippers. So it's a very human labor-based area, and it has been traditionally looked after by the local entrepreneurs. And in advanced economies, you can see that, yes, even that area has been open to foreign investors. But there have been other maritime hubs in the world, such as Dubai, who also have had these kind of restrictions for locals, and that never stopped them from becoming a maritime hub. So Dubai, even to this date, has even America has the Jones Act, which states that all coastal shipping is reserved for American nationals. So every country has their form of encouraging local entrepreneurs. But it should not be at the cost of development of the nation. So as you see, our country has several other priorities in the area before looking at this one area of shipping agency, which is mainly ports, terminals, digitization, and ease of doing business. And then we can obviously look at that when we are a more mature economy.
Thank you, Shehara. My final question is to Professor Abeyratne on this PPP. Now, yes, the private sector has invested in a few PPPs, large in the shipping sector, as she said. But the PP projects are very capital intensive, as you said, very capital intensive, right? So given why is the Sri Lankan companies, one is the ability to invest in such large investments, one or two can put that kind of money. If foreigners are to come to this country invest, then we must have a stable exchange rate and stable inflation. Macro fundamentals must be in place for the risk they are taking, right? So So the space is very limited in that to operate. So to put the macro fundamentals right, it might take some time now, what we are doing. So given that, those restrictions, externally what we have, what you see is the potential then for PPPs, because the government was trying to pass a PPP law and all that. But laws are one thing, but to find the investor is the most difficult thing, right? Because Sri Lankan banks also may not be able to lend that kind of money because single borrow limits, etc., will apply to them. Each of the project costs you $500 million, am I right? Each of the projects for $500 million will cost you easily, a whole project $1 billion. So single borrow limits will come into Sri Lankan banks to play and they can't lend the kind of. But number two is also the interest rates fluctuate so much that you can't have long-term lending. So do you see how do you see we can overcome that situation in order to promote PP? Because that's the only way, as you said, we can encourage less government and more private. Yeah.
I think the private investors, when you look at the international investors, global investors, they get today very quickly, they get the information about where they should consider favorably to put their money. And when they look at Asia, and Asia is moving fast, growing fast, and that's why India is also moving in that direction, building up new ports and threatening Colombo as well. But when the investors look at this scenario, a couple of countries, unlike 50 years ago, today they find that the highly competitive region, so they want to find out the most favorable location for their investment. And about 25, 50 years ago, they must have considered, yes, this is the place. But today it has become very competitive. So the most fundamental key here is actually the building investor confidence. And what are the areas that we have let the investor confidence to get eroded? Regulatory mechanism, corruption, and the government and the political will. In fact, we haven't, I don't know how many times you have invited the private sector to come and invest in our various kind of infrastructure projects. Is the government's willingness to invest by the government itself, even by borrowing from abroad. So this environment has to be built and the policy consistency has to be maintained. We know that how the policy consistency has been damaged over the many years now, and sometimes we see the tax regimes, tax systems change overnight, and in the midnight there are taxes getting changed, and next day morning some of the businesses which were nowhere flourished, and some of the businesses which were doing well collapsed. So this kind of uncertain environments are actually killing the private investment sector. So it's an important question that when you look at how the private investment came to the Asian, our neighboring countries, and why they all miss Sri Lanka, and we hardly achieve $1 billion investment in a year. In fact, a large part of that also the government's negotiated arrangement and not the independent private investment flows. So, but if you look at our neighboring country in India, and $50 billion a year, even with all these other issues, they see that the stability in that business sector. So this is an important critical area that we have to keep improving. In fact, policy reforms are the most important thing that we need to undertake in this case. Policy reforms, we have undertaken major policy reforms only twice during the last 45, 46 years, 1977 and 1989. Only now we are doing the third wave of policy reforms. We are still at the doorstep of policy reforms. So this is the area that we need to improve. Being in a strategic location is good, but is alone not going to be helpful.
Thank you, Shehara, Prof. Abeyratne, and Narendra, for the very insightful and frank discussion that we will have here. On policy consist, on a closing note, I want to say the Ceylon Chamber has done the Vision 2030 document. we have shared the public domain. Shehara was also part of it in her sector. So for 18 sectors, we have given to all political parties the policy. It's a common minimum program. Whoever comes to power need not have different policies on all these areas. So we have spoken to all of them. They have all agreed. I hope they honor those agreements. And to make sure, because Sri Lanka's biggest problem is consistency of policy. We keep changing every 5 years. We can't afford to do that anymore. And I hope the people who take over after 21st will continue the policies that have been done so far. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation. May I hand it over to the computer, please.
Let's put our hands together, ladies and gentlemen, for our panelists. We'd now like to invite on stage Mr. Sujivalal Dahanaika, President-elect and the Chairman of the Conference Committee. We'd also like to invite Mr. Sarath Gamage, our President, to now join us up on stage as we present tokens of appreciation to the session chairman as well as our 3 speakers. This session was all about enhancing infrastructure for economic growth. We'd like to begin by presenting a token to the chairman for this session, Mr. Duminda Hulangamuwa. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together as we thank Mr. Duminda Hulangamuwa for his presence and his expertise. Up next, we would like to appreciate the presence of Engineer Dr. Narendra de Silva, the General Manager of the Ceylon Electricity Board. We have a token coming your way, sir. This is Engineer Dr. Narendra de Silva, who spoke to us about renewable energy. And we have a token presented. Now let's put our hands together for Engineer Dr. Narendra de Silva. Our next speaker who spoke to us about supply chain, transport and logistics was Ms. Shehara de Silva, Managing Director, Mclarens Group of Companies. And we will like to invite our speaker to step forward and accept a token of our appreciation. So here we have Ms. Shehara de Silva, Managing Director, Mclarens Group of Companies. She spoke to us about supply chain, transport and logistics, and we appreciate her presence as well as insights today as we present this token on behalf of OPA. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear your applause for Ms. Shehara de Silva. And of course, our final speaker for this session was Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, Emeritus Professor in Economics at the University of Colombo. He spoke to us about public-private partnership for infrastructure development, and we appreciate his wonderful insights. Let's put our hands together, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sirimal Abeyratne. And with that, we say thank you very much to all of the speakers on stage. We invite you now to take your seats in the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude session 2, it's time